Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just broke down two huge games going on in the state of Texas. We got Florida at Texas as well as Colorado going down to Texas Tech. Going to be an elimination game. A huge one down there in the Big 12, and we'll see what happens in that one. And one team is going to be eliminated, one team still very much alive for that CFP spot from the Big 12. But let's get into that. Let's get into just how many wins gets you into the dance, how many teams are in the conversation right about now. It's quite a few of them as we head down the home stretch of this season, and we'll definitely know more as this week expires, and really next week is going to be a huge one as we get deeper into this season and try to figure out all of the craziness that is coming for us. But let's start in the SEC and give you guys an idea of where I think all of this sits. And there's a number of different teams that are technically still in the race. Frankly, you could probably go down to South Carolina. As crazy as that sounds, I do think South Carolina still has a shot in this race. You know, they're going to have a number of things go their way, obviously, down the stretch of the season, but absolutely, they have really, really impressive losses. They have that huge win over A&M. If they keep rolling on their way, they beat that Clemson at the end of the year, maybe they're a team that sneaks in. But let's focus on the teams that are a little bit more realistic just for the time being. And I think A&M is in a spot where they win out, there's no chance they miss out. Obviously, they're probably going to the SEC championship, in fact, if they win out. So definitely something to watch there. I think if they lose to Texas and LSU loses to Bama, then you're in a little bit of a weird spot because that LSU win is the one you've been hanging your hat on. Missouri is going to fall out. I don't know why they were in the rankings yesterday. Totally different conversation we can have another time. But at the end of the day, that's the win that A&M needs to stay good. If LSU falls out of the conversation, maybe A&M's a little bit more on the chopping block than they would be if they were able to go 10-2 and LSU was also 10-2 and in the dance. So that's going to be something to watch. And then I think the good news is we're going to get one big answer this upcoming weekend in the SEC. The Bama LSU loser is out, no doubt in my opinion. I think there could be a way where it happens, but let's be totally honest, with all of the craziness going on up top, I don't think it's possible. I think the loser of that game is officially out of the running. The winner of that game probably in a pretty good spot. If you look at the schedules for them coming forward, they should be fine the rest of the way. And then if UGA gets the win over Ole Miss will be out of the hunt. So that could give us another answer, and we'll see what happens with that one. If Georgia loses, then it gets a little bit more confusing up at the top, and we'll see what happens in that Tennessee game, which then could be an elimination game. But for Texas, obviously winning out is the goal. It gets them probably into the SEC championship, although there's a weird tiebreaker that would get LSU and Georgia in, but that's a conversation for another time. But it's going to be interesting. If they lose to A&M, do they have the resume that the CFP committee wants for them to put them in? Because it's not necessarily a hugely impressive win on that schedule, especially if they fall to A&M. So definitely going to be a fun battle, and definitely one where it feels like 11 wins, you're a lock, regardless of if you're in the SEC title or not. We could have a number of teams at 11 wins. We could have a 10-win LSU get to the SEC championship over an 11-win Texas. But at the end of the day, if you're at 11 wins, you're a lock. If you get to 10 wins, little bit messy because you have A&M who beat LSU beat Ole Miss could beat Georgia this upcoming weekend, Georgia could beat Tennessee, and Tennessee beat Bama. So it's going to be a nightmare. It's really going to be up to the CFP to try to figure all this out. And obviously if South Carolina run the table and a couple of things break their way, maybe they find their way into the dance. So there's a number of things that can happen in the SEC. As of right now, I'm going to guess it's going to be about 4 teams. I'm going to guess it's all of the teams that are minus odds right here. Not necessarily it's those teams, but I'm going to guess it is 4 teams that have the ability to make it from this conference. I do think there's a chance that you get to 5, but I think Notre Dame will probably have to fall out. I think Indiana would have to get disrespected, and we'll get to that here in a second. But it's going to be interesting to see how all this unfolds. Obviously, they still think Georgia and Texas are the class of that conference. They think Tennessee and Bama are right there. So seems like Vegas likes Bama this weekend. But it's going to be interesting to watch this one unfold, and definitely something where all 7 of these teams are very much in the hunt and probably more, so we'll see what happens here. I'm going to guess 4 teams from the SEC make it, but it could get really messy, and maybe 5, maybe 3. Who knows what happens in this conference, because that's probably the craziest one of the bunch. And then we'll get to probably the cleanest one of the bunch, if I'm being totally honest, because it's the 4 teams up top. We could waste time on Iowa, we could do Minnesota, we could do Illinois. it's the 4 teams up top. No one else really has a shot to make the CFP from this group, and it makes things a little bit more digestible, that is for sure. But for Ohio State, they handle business the rest of the way. They get to play Oregon in Indianapolis at the end of the year. They're both in, no doubt about that. Oregon, Ohio State will be in the dance. Obviously, Indiana will have plenty to say about that. If they beat Ohio State, they're in the dance, and frankly, I think a 10-2 Ohio State would get in, especially with the win over Penn State, but definitely something that it would put them at least on the chopping block. But let's be totally honest, that block goes probably getting into the dance at 10-2. And then I think the big variable here is what happens with an 11-1 Indiana. The record is, great. And the eye test, if you're watching this team, you can tell how good they are. We'll get to that here in a second in a couple of segments. But the reality is, they haven't had that big time win. And if they lose to Ohio State by 14 points, if they lose to Ohio State by 17 points, do you think the CFP would put them in? Frankly, I kind of think they wouldn't. I don't know if they would. I don't know what the conversations are. A little worried about where they put them yesterday. But at the end of the day, I do think it's one of those conversations that it might just be a fight. Does an 11-1 Indiana get in over a 10-2 Tennessee? Did they get in over a 10-2 Alabama? I'd be a little bit surprised. I'll be totally honest with you. So a number of things can happen here. I think if Indiana's 11-1, they should be in, but not my decision to make, I suppose. So this is going to be a fun battle. I would guess those top 4 teams get in. I would guess that Indiana does get the nod at the end of the day. Still kind of precarious situation, obviously, but I do think they're going to find a way to get into the dance. Those 5 teams are the only ones that have a remote shot. Iowa's not getting in. So it makes things a little bit easier. It's going to be those 4 teams possibly, and then probably cut it down to 3 if Indiana doesn't make it. I do think you're probably at least getting 3 from this conference. Unless Penn State slips up again, you're probably getting at least 3 teams from the Big Ten. And then we'll see what happens. We'll see if Indiana gets in with 11 wins. We'll see if they get left out with only 1 loss on the schedule. Then we got the Big 12, and this one is a little bit tougher to get an idea of because the reality is there's tons of teams that are still in the conversation. Colorado's still there, Kansas State, Texas Tech, BYU, all the way up to them, and we'll figure out what happens. But to me, it's a one-bid league. I think the one way that you could see this conference get 2 teams into it is if BYU goes undefeated the rest of the way, so does Iowa State, and Iowa State wins that game in Arlington, because then you'd have a 12-1 Iowa State, you would have a 12-1 BYU. I think both those teams would get in. Now, if a 11-2 Colorado beat you as well, or Texas Tech or Kansas State, I think that could apply as well. But that's definitely something that's a little bit more up in the air. If BYU loses a game to a 2-loss team, does the CFP hold that against them? I don't think they should. I don't think anyone should get anything held against them for playing in their championship game, but kind of the reality that we're going to face, especially in these 2 conferences that I'm about to talk about. But I think the big thing here is if the BYU does fall before the title game, which is still very much on the table, we'll talk about their game upcoming against Utah this weekend. But the reality is if they do fall, it's going to be a one-bid league. Whoever wins that conference is going to find their way in. Whoever loses in the conference championship is going to be on their way out. Now, could an 11-2 Iowa State get in over a 11-1 Indiana? Possibly. It'll be interesting to see how they handle that, but I would lean that Indiana would probably get the nod there, if I'm being totally honest. Maybe 11-2 Iowa State against a 10-2 Tennessee. It's going to be a battle back and forth, and we'll figure out exactly what the CFP thinks about these teams in general. And then there's a number of different things that can happen here. If Notre Dame falls, that's kind of the big variable really in these next 2 conferences. If they fall, then things get a little bit interesting. If Notre Dame stays in, then probably likely that the Big 12 is a one-bid league. Everyone is plus odds, so it gives you a good idea that Vegas is still very much up in the air about who's going to win this conference. Seems like those top 3 have separated just a little bit, but we'll see what happens down the stretch. I'd bet on 1 team, but 2 teams is possible for this group. And then you got the ACC. This one is a little bit crazier because I think the variable here is Pitt. Pitt could go 11-1, have SMU go into the dance, possibly win the ACC championship, and you have an 11-1 Pitt, you have a 12-1 SMU, you have a 12-1 Miami. Then maybe you get 3 teams in. Maybe you have the opening to get 3 teams in. Maybe Notre Dame falls and that opening gets a little bit bigger. Maybe you can knock out a couple of Big 12 teams on the way. Who knows? But I do think it's one of those conversations where it really comes down to 2 teams at this point. It's SMU and Miami. I think if they run the table the rest of the way, if they meet in the championship in Charlotte, whoever wins that game's probably in. If SMU were to lose that game, I think they could be on the outside looking in, as they are right now, sitting at number 13 in the CFP rankings. And then for Miami, if they were able to win out and then possibly lose in the ACC championship, I think they'd have an opening, but I don't know. It's a little bit of a precarious kind of resume for them right now with a couple of close wins, a couple of games they had to come back in, a couple of questionable calls, quote unquote. We'll have to figure out how they think about Miami, and I think this could be two teams. My prediction would probably be two teams, I think. I'm kind of fighting myself right now, but overall, I do think it's going to be a really interesting game, but I think SMU might have to win that ACC championship if they're going to get two teams in. So maybe it is just one team. Maybe Pitt can sneak in at the end of the day. It's a conference that'll probably work itself out over the next little bit. Clemson and Pitt are going to play each other. That'll knock one of them out. So obviously a lot of this stuff will be figured out. Again, if Notre Dame falls, opens the door just a little bit more. If Penn State or Indiana fall a couple of times, that opens the door a little bit more. I would guess one team as of right now. Two is not necessarily far-fetched by any means either. So definitely something to watch here. And you only have Miami. That is minus odds right now. So it's pretty much them setting the pace. SMU not shortly behind. Clemson, they're holding out hope for. A team that I'd be surprised if they found their way in. I think a lot of things would have to go their way. They'd probably have to win the conference, frankly, if they were going to find their way in. But at the end of the day, definitely going to be something to watch. And Vegas isn't giving Pitt much of a shot. So definitely something to watch there. And then the group of five, we'll just give you the odds here, and it is Boise State setting the pace, no doubt about that. Army's a little bit down below. It's just because of that Notre Dame game. If they were to win that, they'd be the number one team in a second. I can almost promise you that, and we'll see what happens down the stretch. Army has a ton of tough games coming up. They have the Notre Dame game, they have the Navy game, and then you're probably playing either Tulane, Memphis, ULL, someone like that in the Sun Belt Championship. Going to be a little bit of a battle. And you got a couple other teams here. Louisiana, we just talked about. UNLV, still in the dance. If they can win out the rest of the way, win the Mountain West, they would have a loss to Syracuse, and they would have avenged their loss to Boise State. So maybe they could find their way in. Tulane, still a team that's very much in it. And frankly, I think the team that's probably the second best in the group of five behind Boise State. So definitely something to watch. Right now, I would bet on Boise State. It's definitely going to be one team from the group of five. I'd love to think that it's going to be multiple, but with the absolute logjam in the other conferences, I'd be shocked. Maybe if Army goes undefeated and Boise State's 12-1 and Notre Dame loses, you have a little bit more of an opening there, but I think it's probably going to be one team. And then you do have Washington State. That's not necessarily in the group of five conversation, but is in the at-large conversation. They're 7-1. They're in the rankings right now. If they don't fall the rest of the way, maybe they're sitting there just waiting for a spot. So a lot of things can happen at that level. And frankly, a lot of things can happen all over the place. It is going to be a crazy battle to the finish in this last couple of weeks. And maybe a couple of teams pull away in these conferences. Maybe they come a little bit more clear. Maybe the SEC has 5, 10-2 teams at the end of the day, and we have to figure out which 2, which 3, which 4 are finding their way into the dance. So it's going to be awesome to watch. It's going to be chaotic to watch, but it's going to be plenty fun, and we'll definitely keep you updated as we move along. But let's take our third break here, and when we come back, we got to talk about upset alerts all around the country, including in the top 10. There's quite a few upset alerts that we're going to break down right after this.